that balance, for example, how these individuals are treated and how they're commemorated, and on the other hand, how these individuals with their own conscience, they can't handle on their own conscience, and what that does to them. I mean, if we look at the makeup of the American military, and now these individuals are going to be more in harm's way. I think the effect in general, in your perspective, Ken, that this can have, of course, on the Americans themselves.
Well, the American people have yet to learn, in the first place, that their government is not seriously involved in trying to defeat ISIS in Iraq or Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups in Syria. The fact of the matter is that there is a tremendous amount of evidence to show that the U.S. is the inspiration, or was the inspiration, behind the founding and the spread, the conquest by ISIS, and of course, the use in Syria of Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, and other terrorists as proxy warriors to smash and fracture up, break up the country of Syria as well. The truth of the matter is, the U.S. is the main spot. They accuse Iran of this, but the U.S. and Israel, its client state, are the principal sponsors of terrorism in the Middle East. The U.S. aided and abetted ISIS for 4 or 5 years. They preferred to attack the Syrian government forces rather than ISIS, and they are still supporting the remnants of the Al-Qaeda and other terrorists who are holed up in the province of Idlib in Syria. So the American people really don't know about this. Of course, Senator Black, who you quoted, has been very good on this, and I wish that he were the Secretary of State of the United States rather than Mr. Pompeo, but he's not, and the American people are unaware, actually, of the role of their government in promoting ISIS and Al-Qaeda. So I think that hopefully in the course of the awakening that I think is going to take place over these terrible and cowardly assassinations, these flagrant violations of international law, that some learning will be done by the American people. They'll hear from alternate media sources, such as Press TV and others, that their government and its client state, Israel, has been the main proponent of terrorism in the Middle East.
Okay, and on that note, let me just read again breaking news at the bottom of the screen that the Fatah Hezbollah again has warned Iraqi security forces to stay away from U.S. bases, of course, warning that they stay away from the U.S. bases in Iraq, basically saying that definitely the U.S. bases are definitely very likely to be under attack. Well, I thank both of you for being with us, Ken Stone and Rodney Shakespeare, for contributing to this part of our rolling coverage here at Press TV. Thank you so much. And viewers, stay with us. I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
Could you please, when you have a moment, send me the link to this interview?
Okay, yeah, definitely we will be sending you the links. Thanks so much.
One other thing.
Thanks so much for being with us.
I was hoping to talk about the position taken by the Canadian government, the terrible position taken by the Canadian government in this matter, and so if I get another chance at some other time, I would be delighted to talk about that.
Okay, Devin, what you want to do it in this next couple of minutes? You can go ahead and take a couple of minutes and say that. You want to talk about the role of the Canadian government. Go ahead.
Well, I am very shocked and very disappointed by the statement that was issued by our new Foreign Minister, Monsieur Champagne, who said in just a few paragraphs that all parties should show restraint in this matter. Number one is, I don't feel that the Iraqi government in particular needs to show any restraint right now. I think the right thing for the Iraqi government to say is, we withdraw the invitation for the United States to remain with its troops in Iraq, and they need to get out now. So that's the first point.
Mm-hmm.
The second point is that the Canadian, Monsieur Champagne, instead of criticizing the United States for its illegal and flagrant violation here and this extrajudicial assassination, it chose to criticize General Soleimani and say that his role has been problematic. Well, you know, actually, General Soleimani is on the same side as our Canadian troops, which are in Iraq right now in the role of trainers of the Iraqi army. Your Canadian soldiers who are there are supposed to be helping the Iraqi army fight Daesh, make sure that the Israeli-supported Kurdish separatists in the north stay part of the Iraqi state, and to defeat ISIS. And that's exactly what General Soleimani was doing. So the Canadian government and General Soleimani of the Quds Brigade in Iran were doing the same thing. And what the Canadian government should have said is, we regret the death, the untimely death of General Soleimani, who was an ally of ours, and we condemn the United States for its flagrant violation of the UN Charter and international law, which affects every country in the world. It makes the world a less safe place. So that's why, that's what I wanted to say about the terrible position that the Canadian government has taken.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ken, for being with us. And hopefully we'll be talking soon. That's Ken Zone out of Hamilton, Canada. And as you can see, the breaking news there at the bottom of your screen, that Grand Ayatollah Sistani's son has actually welcomed the funeral procession in the holy Iraqi city of Najaf. Of course, the bodies of these individuals have been going through various towns and cities in Iraq, and the crowds have been massive in each of those cities. And of course, now General Soleimani's body is going to be flown or brought to Iran. And tomorrow, his body will be taken to the holy city of Mashhad. On Monday, his body will be brought back here to Tehran, where the prayer will be led by the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. And on Tuesday, he will be buried in his hometown of Kerman. But I'd like to welcome my guest to the program, Scott Ricard, commentator and former American intelligence linguist out of Tampa. Scott, thanks so much for being with us. Well, Scott, the amazing times that we can say, indeed. And interestingly enough, when U.S. President Donald Trump was running for election, he actually thanked the Iranians for their role in helping to stop terrorism. He was talking about the situation inside of Syria, and of course one of the main ones who was leading that was Lieutenant General Soleimani. Of course, once he became president, the story totally changed, and we saw him targeting the man that had played the biggest role in destroying terrorism in the world, Lieutenant General Soleimani. What do you make of all of this? I mean, Scott, when you heard this news, I mean, what went through your mind as an American and as an analyst?
Well, this is unfortunately the status quo for the West. They've been doing this for quite some time. Very indicative of what happened to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. As soon as the Americans had accomplished their task with their mercenary forces, they abandoned them, and then they also eventually became enemies as well. Certainly the PMF or the PMU, started by an American-backed puppet, Maliki, in Iraq, was very instrumental in setting up the paramilitary forces and the militias that, as our previous speaker and you have said, fought alongside the Americans in Mosul and elsewhere in the fight against, some individuals who had created this ISIS. This was really some of the old Ba'ath Party individuals out of Iraq, and certainly the mercenaries that ran amok that the United States, unfortunately Turkey, Qatar, certainly Saudi Arabia, and even obviously Israel and Jordan had participated alongside the Americans as well as the French and the British in overthrowing or attempting to overthrow Assad. And all of these mercenaries obviously were uncontrollable, and once they joined with the Iraqis and those forces took over Mosul and elsewhere. This is very indicative of what happened in Libya as well. If you look recently at Libya, the paramilitary forces that were brought in by the Americans and the Italians and the French and the other NATO allies, they also went amok. They actually started attacking uranium mines in Mali, and the mercenaries that were hired there, many of those were transferred to Syria, and certainly many from elsewhere in former Soviet states were transferred there. So we have a large history in the United States of actually using mercenaries, and then once we're done with them, basically getting rid of them or turning on them, definitely betraying their interest. Did the same thing with the Peshmerga and the PKK, alongside what happened with Turkey. Certainly the Peshmerga and the PKK are still American and Israeli allies. However, I'm sure they're much more aware of the fact that they can easily be turned upon.
I'd like to welcome our next guest to the program, Margaret Kimberly, Black Agenda Report of New York. Margaret, thanks so much for being with us. Your take on all of this. Were you shocked by the news that you heard?
I was shocked. Well, first of all, I'd like to extend my condolences to the people of Iran and Iraq for this attack, this act of war. I was shocked. I thought that cooler heads might prevail. Trump is a very rash man, so when I thought about it, maybe I should not have been surprised. I think there's several things that precipitated this. I don't think it was just the protest, the attack on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. A week ago, Russia, Iran, and China had joint maneuvers. I think this just made it clear how the United States is losing influence and power. And these are all very desperate people. They don't know how to respond to Iran's continued sovereignty. The fact that Iran still exists, that they did not overthrow the revolution, and that Iran is not isolated in the world. That's what Americans are constantly told by Trump and by the corporate media, who just parrot whatever he says, that Iran is isolated and alone, and it is not. Iran has very important allies. Iran is very influential in that region. And I also think that Israel played a role in this assassination. Trump does whatever the Israeli government tells him to do. And I think in combination with his rashness and his lack of acumen, he did something that was obviously very wrong, a violation of international law, and also very foolish.
Okay, and let me just read some of the breaking news. U.S. protesters holding banners reading "No to War." Sanctions on Iran. Of course, we've seen demonstrations taking place outside in Washington, D.C., outside of the White House, as Americans are basically saying no to war and actually get out of Iraq, bring the troops home. And, you know, Margaret, before you joined us, I was saying that I remember in 2003 that I participated in a demonstration in New York prior to the start of the war. And I believe 1 million people actually turned out for that and saying we don't want war in Iraq. And of course now 16, 17 years later, we're still looking at U.S. troops in Iraq and actually playing a very negative role. So, you know, when we see these demonstrations, on the one hand, people are turning out and they're saying they don't want war. But on the other hand, there are those analysts that say, listen, the United States basically does whatever it wants, whenever it wants. And then when there's talk about retribution, revenge, again we hear, well, no war. And understandably, no one really wants war in a situation like that. But when is it that individual countries have the right actually to retaliate against the United States for its actions in killing its people and killing its leaders and doing so much damage, not only in this region but around the world?
Well, every country should have sovereignty. Every country has a right to self-defense. And the United States acts as though it has the right to act offensively, to attack other nations militarily, to attack with sanctions. But other nations have that right as well. And Americans are so misinformed, unfortunately, that if Iraq were to act within its rights and retaliate, they unfortunately would be shocked, would consider themselves the victims, which is very unfortunate. But this is an election year. We have some of the Democratic candidates voicing opposition. Bernie Sanders actually used the word assassination, which was appropriate. He should have. That's what it was. So I think all the stars may be aligned. And I think this may become, again, the issue of war, one that impacts people and affects how they vote and how they go about making decisions. There are demonstrations all over the country today, more than 75 places in Washington, D.C., in New York, in Chicago, and in smaller cities. So I think people are afraid. People are afraid that Trump will start some larger a war, literally a shooting war with Iran or with its allies, and I think that fear is motivating people to speak up.
All right, stay with me, Scott and Margaret. Viewers, you're looking at our continual coverage, of course, of the situation that's taking place in the region, and that, of course, the assassination of Lieutenant General Soleimani and, of course, Abdul Mahdi al-Muhandis. You're looking now at these live images coming out of Najaf, Iraq. Of course, Najaf being one of the holy cities in Iraq and the city of the first Shia Imam, Imam Ali. And what we have been seeing all day are images from city to city, town to town, that the bodies have, there have been processions throughout the country. And we have seen Iraqis turn out en masse. We saw prayers being performed for the martyrs in Karbala. Karbala, Iraq, of course, is a very, very significant city in Islamic history, and of course it symbolizes resistance. We saw actually many flags out, and Wissam was here earlier with me, and he talked about the significance of the color of the flags, even, that there were a lot of red flags that the people were holding, and the red flags symbolizes retaliation, that they won't rest until there is retaliation for what has been done. Of course, we're looking at these split screen now images out of Najaf. I can't see any coffins, so probably the procession is on the way. We see a lot of people on the left side, especially concentrated on the screen, that waiting for the coffins to come. This has been going on all day, as I said, in Iraq, from city to city to city. Now, I believe what was told earlier to me was that General Soleimani's body would be brought back to Iran tonight. Perhaps it's going to be tomorrow morning. I don't know, because it's getting late. But tomorrow, his body will be taken to the holy city of Mashhad here in Iran, where we're expecting an unbelievable turnout there. And then on Monday, his body will be brought here to the capital, Tehran, where the prayer will be led by the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. And on Tuesday, his body will be laid to rest in his hometown of Kerman. You know, Margaret, when we look at this unbelievable pour of emotion and support and solidarity between Iran and Iraq and other nations today as a result of this act of terrorism by the United States, I'm still trying to understand the thought process. Again, I'm repeating what I had mentioned earlier. If you know a region, if you know particular countries, if you know the traditions of certain societies, or you should anyway, before going into them, and with the United States, it's been in this region so long, one would think that it would know better than actually to do what it has done, to kill these revered military leaders from the region. It just seems that there's such a major miscalculation or lack of understanding exactly what this means. Margaret, your perspective.
Well, you're right. And a couple of months ago, Trump went against the advice of his Secretary of State and refused to launch a missile strike on Iran after Iran shot down the spy drone. And so I was thinking that maybe he was able to think independently somewhat. But I think since that time, I believe Israel is playing a role here. Benjamin Netanyahu is also facing discord at home. He is facing criminal charges. So he has an incentive to want to change the subject to, you know, when they go to war, they always become more popular. So we can see why Netanyahu would want to do this. Israel always wants America to do what it wants. Trump has, I don't believe, has ever told them no on any issue that they've wanted, from moving the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem to leaving the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA agreement, ratcheting up sanctions. So I'm pretty sure that Israel is behind this.
That's an interesting point that you've just made, Margaret. Sorry to interrupt you, but listen to what you were saying. And how did he become such a yes man for the Zionist regime when he was running for president? He talked about draining the swamp. And if we want to talk about draining the swamp, we understand the effect of course, the Zionist lobby and the effect that it has on politicians. So if there needed to be draining of a swamp, then definitely they would probably be one of the first ones targeted. But then we see totally opposite, as you've just mentioned. You said you don't think that there has been any decision that he hasn't, that they've requested, that he hasn't agreed with them on. Why?
Well, it's partly American politics. There's a very powerful man, very wealthy man named Sheldon Adelson, a Republican, who has given millions of dollars to Republican presidential candidates. He finally hit the jackpot with when Trump won. He supported Trump and he won, and against expectations. So people like him are, and he's a Zionist and very outspoken about his politics. So Trump is controlled, American politics is controlled by people like him. Also, Trump has his own political problems now with impeachment. The Senate is controlled by Republicans. They probably will not vote to remove him. But he has, there are some observers who say he is being threatened with removal if he does not toe the line with the surveillance state and with Israel. That's conjecture, I hasten to add. But I think that his impeachment is working in ways that may not have been foreseen. But the president is not the most powerful person in the country. That's always true. There are always people and forces that can control them and get them to do what they want. And also, I don't think we can ever underestimate Trump's lack of preparation for the office. He is a man who is probably the most ill-prepared president and least likely to acknowledge that he is. He depends on people like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who, not to put too fine a point on it, is a very stupid person who bragged about, he used to be CIA director, he bragged about how the CIA lied and cheated and stole. Well, we know that, but most people are smart enough not to actually say it. So it's a combination of his own political peril right now, his close relations with Israel, and the fact that if Israel asks him to do something, he will comply.
Okay. Again, viewers, you're looking at these images coming out of Najaf, the holy city of Najaf in Iraq. As this procession, as I said earlier, the bodies have been going throughout the country. And now they have entered Najaf, Iraq, where the people are out en masse to say goodbye. Goodbye to these revered military leaders who were assassinated, victims of American terrorism on Friday. Well, Scott, when we look at, excuse me, when we look at the overall situation, I mean, you were involved as far as with the United States and dealing with certain aspects of the military. I mean, one would think, again, I will say, that there is investigation into cultures of the people, into the possible effect that any decision, military-wise, could make on a society in the region and beyond. You know, what we saw earlier, images coming out of Karbala. Karbala is symbolic, is a symbol, especially for Shia Muslims, of resistance, that it is ready, one would be ready to die and to live their lives with oppression, that independence is the ultimate goal. So the symbolism and the anger, as well as the sorrow that people had, just knowing the culture well, understanding the situation, I would think that the United States is in deep trouble right now in the region. I do not think that they understand how much they have united this people and how much actually we're seeing from our young people throughout the region in calling for a response to what has happened. Do they look at the culture? Do they sit down and calculate? Or what is going on here?
Well, unfortunately, they do not. They really don't look at the culture of the people as much as they look at the economics as well as the geopolitical influences in the region. You know, Margaret was very clear about Israel, but also very significantly in the region, Saudi Arabia has been incredibly involved in what's happened in Iraq, obviously what's happened in Syria and throughout the region. In Saudi Arabia, much like Netanyahu, the princes have had very close ties with not only Donald Trump, but many people in the United States. Donald Trump has personal friendships and has been bailed out financially by the Saudis, and certainly has personal relationships with the mafioso in the United States, as well as Netanyahu personally in New York City. In fact, Netanyahu is also close friends with his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. So there's a lot of personal ties, a lot of commercial ties. The fact is that these other people are really just looked upon as demons. They did the same thing. They demonized Japanese. They demonized, obviously, the Germans. They've demonized, certainly, the American Indians. And we'll see a demonization of Iran. We actually saw it for the last 50 years, around 40 years since the Iraqis have liberated themselves from American dominance and American puppetry under the Shah and certainly the CIA in Iran from the 50s to the late 70s. So this is a long-standing, sad situation that the United States has imposed, unfortunately, not only on Iran, but has also imposed on Iraq. Saddam Hussein's another great example. Certainly, the Americans rained down rockets on Iran, provided Saddam Hussein with weapons of mass destruction, gassing not only the Kurds but also the Iranian people. Over 500,000 people died at the hands of the United States and Saddam Hussein. And then once the Americans were done with him, they went in and assassinated him as well. So you see the fact that the PMU followed the same lines, the PMF followed the same lines, and Maliki followed the same lines. He was the Saudis did not want anything to do with Maliki from the get-go since 2005, 2006 when he took office, and certainly that still in line. They look at the PMU as a force that they're not going to agree with. And in fact, what's really interesting that you mentioned is that the Shiites, for the first time, a lot of the tribal factions have been at each other's throats for quite some time. They are actually unifying under this event. So, my take on this is that take this as a chance to unify as a nation in Iraq, and do not react militarily or violently against the U.S., but peacefully escort them out of your country. Get them out as fast as you can, and work alongside your neighbors like Iran and other neighbors too.
Well, Scott, how would you, you said definitely don't attack the Americans, but escort them out peacefully. How do you see that being possible when the United States, actually we saw even today, that again they attack PMU forces? How can they be escorted out? It's not as if the Iraqis say, okay, thanks so much, please leave, it's enough, and that they will say, okay, yes, we're leaving. That's not usually how it works. How do you see that?
So the leadership in the country has to speak out internationally. Obviously, international opinion is going to be with Iraq. This is a great moment to do this. The Iraqi people have an excellent opportunity to once and for all force the exit as a unified nation, unified in the parliament, unified in international court, unified at the UN. Come and give a message as a unified nation that you once and for all want the Americans out for good. And this would include, unfortunately, in the north, there's quite a bit cooperation because the Americans are once you go K1 and north of Iraq, the Americans have quite a foothold up there with their relationship with the Kurds. However, in that relationship, I believe that the Kurds could also work alongside, and that would be the linchpin that would guarantee the exit of the United States, given the kinds of peaceful requests and the peaceful protests. Once it becomes violent, it gives the Americans exactly what they want. This provocation of murdering really what could be considered a joint chief of staff. Just imagine if someone was visiting a third-party country, Iraq or elsewhere, and that particular senior military official was assassinated, not just at gunpoint, but from air support, from an airstrike, from an orchestrated, planned airstrike assassination. This is absolutely an act of war, and certainly meant to provide the correct provocation to lead to war. This is absolutely exactly what the Pentagon wants. This is exactly what the CIA wants. This is exactly what the neocons and the PNAC individuals want. They want once and for all. They found that they cannot work with any of the governments in Iraq. Iraq has proven to be wanting its independence and not wanting to be a puppet. And the fact is that Iran has also proven to be an extremely sufficient adversary and has sufficiently survived despite the international criminal terrorism and international criminal economic terrorism that has been imposed on Iran, just unfortunately longer than any other nation other than maybe Cuba and North Korea. So there is a very serious event that can be used for the good of not only the Iraqi people but certainly Iranian people to avoid any kind of conflict. Having a conflict with the United States because of the amount of firepower, unfortunately, it would turn the area into very much like Syria, Libya, Yemen, and elsewhere. We just have too many weapons. We've developed too much weaponry along the way. Our country is absolutely ready for warfare, and it's proven over and over again that it's more than happy to use it, not caring a bit about the human loss of life and any type of culture whatsoever.
Well, Margaret, your take on this, what Scott was saying, Sorry, let me just talk about these images that we're getting in. Again, we see the black-clad crowd there now gathered in Najaf, of course, with pictures of the various individuals who were assassinated in that Friday terrorist attack by the United States. The people have turned out in mass throughout the country today in the various cities. We saw in Qadamain, we saw in Karbala, and now we're looking at the holy city of Najaf there, where the holy shrine, of course, of the first Shia Imam, Imam Ali, is located. Well, Margaret, what I was going to say was basically what Scott had talked about. Now that he says with the situation that Iraq can get the international community on its side. But if we look in general at these international organizations, and basically they seem to side with the United States or basically be silent. I mean, we had the most recent case, if we look at the OPCW and the whole thing in dealing with the Duma Syria attacks, and whether it was the Syrian government or it was the terrorist group, and how even the report was manipulated by this international organization. And of course, in the process, the United States, France, and UK actually sent missiles to Syria. So your take on this? So what's the answer? On the one hand, we see the reaction of the international, so-called international community like this. Tell me your thoughts.
Well, you're right. Other countries don't speak up enough. For example, the European countries, they signed the JCPOA agreement, Britain, France, Germany, along with the United States, Russia, and China.
Mm-hmm.
And when Trump withdraws from it, they go along with sanctions. They could band together and say, no, we're not going to do it. But ultimately, the Western European nations, NATO and EU nations, are U.S. puppets. So they, I am sure, are very angry about this. I'm sure this is something they would not want to happen. But when the U.S. Acts this way, they go along. Now, you mentioned the OPCW and the manipulation of evidence in Syria. Well, let's just be more blunt. There was we were told there was a chemical attack, a chlorine attack in Duma, and that it killed people. Now, people died. We don't know who killed them, but OPCW inspectors came forward. Whistleblowers came forward. WikiLeaks released the documents which showed that evidence was manipulated, that inspectors doubted there was an attack all along. This was used as a pretext for war, and in this case, Britain and France went right along with the United States. And we've seen nothing about this in the corporate media, by the way. No politicians have brought it up. So everything we were told about Assad gassing his own people was a lie. And but in the absence of this being a news story, in the absence of any politicians asking about it, it's in effect as if it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So the United States has sometimes willing accomplices, sometimes not so willing accomplices. They just do as they're told. So the international community that actually has the power to stand up to the United States won't do it. The nations that aren't aligned, they don't have the financial or military strength to stand up to the U.S. Russia and China do, and have become closer and closer over the years as a result of U.S. meddling in their affairs. So but that is changing, and I think one of the rationales, if it can be called a rationale for this assassination, is this desperation that Iran is not alone, that Iran does have friends in the world, important friends, powerful friends in Russia and China, and I think that there was not a lot of thought behind it. And the other things I said, the pressure from Israel, pressure from some politicians in the country, pressure from Republican Party funders, all of that is true. But ultimately, I believe it was an act of desperation on the part of people do not accept, understand that the U.S. is not the hegemon that it used to be. They don't know how to respond.
All right, and on that note, I'd like to thank both of you for being with us, Scott Ricard and Margaret Kimberly. Scott Ricard, commentator and former American intelligence linguist out of Tampa. Margaret Kimberly from Black Agenda Report out of New York. And listening to what Margaret has said about the situation and about the Europeans and others, and perhaps that is the reason why the people of this region more and more are saying that resistance is the only way, that they cannot depend on any other entities but themselves. Of course, we're following this story very, very closely and continuously here at Press TV. I'd like to thank everybody for being with me. I'm going to say goodbye for now, but my good colleague Danny will be taking it from here. We're going to take a look at some images from the various processions of the day. Thanks so much.